Hello friends, welcome to another day of e-learning. Hey, we are getting so close. You've only got a few more presentations to go. Just a heads up, today's listening excerpts are going to be a little hard on your ears, quite possibly. We're going to be looking at what's called atonal music and looking at some of the philosophy behind it, but just understand, especially for an untrained ear, this is going to be a little more challenging to listen to. It's challenging for me as well, but we're going to do our best to take a listen, and today's presentation should wind up being a little bit shorter. All right, so here we go. So the time period we're going to be looking at is on the immediate side, either side of World War I, the immediate years preceding and following. We're going to be looking at modernism, composers basically feeling that the constraints of the Romantic era, the system of chords and harmonies that existed, needed to be thrown away so we could break new ground in music. We needed to organize music in different ways. And what you're going to hear is that music is going to go atonal for a lot of composers. Now, tonal music is the idea that we've been working with pretty much exclusively up to this point. That music is described in chords and harmonies that have very specific rules. You've got your triads, da 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 da, and those put together create a chord, or da 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 da, minor chord. Or in your earlier years, you've got like the counterpoint of Bach and so forth, and ideas that notes one-on-one to each other, there were still rules about which ones fit together and made good sounds. We're going to throw a lot of that out. Atonal music dispenses of that and lumps notes together in other kinds of systems that may not necessarily have to do with what sound is produced, but may have some more mathematical reasoning, which we'll look at that in just a little bit. The guy that we really need to start with to understand all this is a guy named Arnold Schoenberg. He's a German composer who lived from 1874 to 1951. And he was a major champion of atonal music, and he invented what's called the 12-tone method, which we'll talk about in just a minute. He was born to a Jewish family. He studied violin and taught himself composing by, again, imitating other types of music that he knew. So again, for those of you budding composers out there, study music that's already in existence that you like to expand your composing capabilities. Anyways, he worked his way into a composition instruction position at the Stern Conservatory, and then he later became a private teacher, and his influence greatly shaped the work of Alban Berg, who we will look at, and Anton Webern, who we're not going to get to. He originally wrote in a late Romantic style, but in 1908 he switched to atonal writing, and he experimented with what are called pitch class sets. This is an idea that I'm going to take this pitch, and this pitch, whether they make a chord, a traditional chord or not, but we're going to treat them like chords from that point on. So he would write with these pitch class sets. He utilized what's called chromatic saturation. Now, in an octave, da, da, everything, so let's say C and C, even though I don't have perfect pitch, so those may not be C's, but that's not the point. There are 12 pitches that make that up. Da 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 da. Boom. There are your 12 pitches, including C and C on either end. If you use all 12 of those pitches in a very short amount of space, like in a few measures, that's what's called chromatic saturation. You can hear an example of him utilizing these pitch sets and this chromatic saturation in his Pierrot Lunaire, which is poetry that describes someone having these terrible visions because of how the moon is shining on them. Anyways, you're gonna hear these patterns that he creates that don't tend to make a lot of sense, but you're gonna hear them transformed and copied in other octaves as well. And you're gonna hear what's called Sprechstimme in the soprano voice. Sprechstimme is just shy of singing. You have printed pitches on the page, but you kind of approximate those pitches, and it's almost like speaking high and low, but with a little bit of sustain. That's Sprechstimme. Your voice is going to glide up and down, but it's not going to quite actually sing the pitches. So I'd like you to listen to just a little bit of the prelude of Pierrot, or the first movement of Pierrot Lunaire. I've got that pulled up in your playlist. You don't have to listen to tons of it, but do take a listen to that and listen for the Sprechstimme. Again, that's the approximating, the gliding, the almost melodic speaking without actually singing the pitches themselves exactly. So take a listen. Now, that was in 1908 when he started writing in that form. 1920s, he invents what's called the 12-tone method. This is really fascinating. It's this idea, his philosophy is I don't want repetition. It needs to be avoided so that we can expand our musical vocabulary. And, you know, as we've heard, even if it's subtle, patterns are kind of how we operate. You hear that in phrasing, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. We look for patterns. We look for things that we can cling on to and understand orally. But he was like, let's throw that out. We've got to expand music. We need to build music in other ways. So his 12-tone method, remember those chromatic pitches I talked about? C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, C. You got that? Those 12 chromatic pitches. So lay those out in a grid, and then you use the different rows that result to write your music. So, and you've got an example of a grid filled out here. Typically, once you start down one of the rows, like let's take the top row there, F, E flat, B flat, A, B, E, C, D, G, G sharp, F sharp, C sharp. You write an F somewhere. It can be up in the melody, it can be up in the bass. And as you move on to the next rhythm, and if you want to repeat that F a couple times, you can, da 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 da, whatever it might be. You go on to E flat as your next pitch, and you can't go use F again until you've gone through all the others in order. So that's kind of how it works. Now there's different ways you can flex with that. You can fluctuate with that. Like let's say you write the F up in the melody, but then you write the E flat down in the bass line, so you see that line moving around. Or you know, you write part of the sequence in the melody, then you write part of the sequence in the bass line or in a harmony somewhere else. There's ways to kind of get around some of that. But the purpose of it, in the words of the great Leonard Bernstein, this is a type of democracy amongst pitches. You're trying to make them all equal. So especially if you have the lowest and highest pitches that naturally would have had more weight, you might play them a little shorter so that everything gets emphasized equally. And then you can see you can then reverse the patterns backward and invert them, and I'll explain that in just a sec. So let's look at it in a little bit of a different way. If we assign each of those chromatic pitches a number, with 0 being the first and the octave, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 in between, then here's another way that you can create this grid. And if you look, you're going to see how the inversion of it works and how you maintain patterns. For example, let's look at row 1. You go 4 to 3, and the difference between those is a -1, right? So look at the next row, 5 to 4. The difference between those is -1. Look at the next row, 3 to 2, -1. So it works that way. Let's go down and see if it works. Let's take the inversion. So we're going to go down row 1, 4 to 5. That's a +1. So theoretically, the next one starts on 3. We should add 1. 3 to 4. That's a +1. Look back at the first row. 4, 5, 5 to 3. That's a -2. 4 to 2 in the next one. That's a -2 also. And that's how all of these work. You're going to see these patterns happening over and over. So you've got the invert and you've got the reverse or the retrograde. And this is maintained throughout the whole thing. Whatever your prime row was, your first pattern, and you see it there, it's listed as P0. That would have been whatever the first pattern was that they chose. You follow that pattern going across, and you use the pattern to invert going down as well. So how do we invert? Well, let's take a look. Go across the top row with me. Okay, so the top row, as we go across, we'll use that as our example. 4 to 3. Again, that's a -1. So if we want to invert that, go down. 4 to 5, that's a +1. And that's how we start inverting. So you do the opposite. If you subtracted going across, you add going down. If you added going across, you subtract going down. And you're going to wind up, every single one of these rows ends up creating this. It ends up using all the chromatic pitches, but in a different order. And then you can utilize these different rows in your composition. So here it is again. with actual pitch names. So let's take a look at the top. F to E flat. We're going across now in the first row, the original, the prime row. F to E flat, that's a whole step down. So in theory, the next row should follow the same pattern. G to F, that is a whole step down. Now on the other hand, if we follow the column down, we should be doing the opposite. So if F to E flat is a whole step down, we should probably be going up a whole step when we go down. And sure enough, F to G is a whole step up. So there's the inversion right there. And then retrograde inversion is backwards, retrograde. Anyways, this is how this all works. So, an example, sorry I got cut off on the last slide, by the way. An example of how this works is Schoenberg's Piano Suite, Opus 25. You're going to see on the little sample that I've got on the page 4 of his rows, and they're listed there. So the top row, it's E natural, F natural, G natural, D flat, G flat, E flat, A flat, D natural, B natural, C natural, A natural, B flat. So there's one of his rows. And you can see how he applies that first row there in the first 2 lines. He uses part of it there in the melody, but he also uses the same opening part of it in the bass. He takes a break for a minute and works on other rows, and then he comes back and finishes that row. There was a lot of flexibility. I mean, if you're inventing a system, you can do it however you want. Like, you make the rules at that point because you've invented a new system. So listen to how this all turns out in his prelude from his Piano Suite Opus 25. It's going to sound a bit chaotic, especially again to our ears, but it's carefully thought out for the repetition and the use of these chromatic pitches. So take a listen to at least just a little bit of it, more than 2 measures. Listen to at least 5 measures, and then come back and join us. Now, we mentioned that 2 of Schoenberg's students continued on his tradition with great success, Alban Berg and Anton Webern. We're going to look at Berg for just a little bit because he took these ideas and applied them to opera. He took Schoenberg's atonal methods, but he combined them with traditional forms. Remember, form being the structure, layout of a piece. He combined them with traditional forms of tonal music. And his opera Wozzeck expresses that. Now, Wozzeck is just a really tragic story about a poor man. Because he's poor, he ends up having to be part of these doctors' experiments. He's betrayed by his lover, and then he ends up murdering her, and then I think he commits suicide at the end, if I remember right. It's just really dark. The scene that I'm going to have you listen to just a little bit of is when he's in a tavern. He's just murdered his ex, and he's kind of wrestling with guilt. And you're going to hear references to tonal music. The scene opens with what sounds like a polka on the piano. It's on a honky-tonk piano. It's out of tune. But it's also like, what notes did they choose? Like, the rhythm sounds like polka, and it sounds like they're kind of using chords, but which notes? Like, it's a little odd. And you're going to hear that. You're going to hear pitch sets being used and inverted, and these represent the character of Wozzeck. So if you've got a good ear, if you hear that pitch set over and over, you're going to go, oh, this is for Wozzeck. It's kind of like that leitmotif that we heard with Wagner. You're going to hear rhythms and styles that sound familiar, but again, it's just like, what notes did they choose for that? Like, this sounds like it should have worked, but someone didn't know what accidentals to put in. So take a listen to just a little of Scene 3 from Act 3. I wouldn't encourage you to listen to much of it, and again, because it's very dark, and I would encourage you to stick with, if you're into the YouTube, stick with the version I put on, because I cannot, in good faith, recommend some of the others, because the staging is just, frankly, there's some inappropriate staging in some of the others. But just listen to those patterns and how you can hear like, oh, that sounds kind of familiar, but the notes are all over the place. You're also going to hear a little more Sprechstimme. So take a listen to just a little bit of that and then come back and join us. All right, now this is going to sound like such a palate cleanser after all this. We're going to listen to something a bit more tonal. You remember how Russia and Tchaikovsky really gave birth to the modern ballet? So carrying on that tradition, you have Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky was born in 1882 near St. Petersburg, died in 1971 while living in Los Angeles, and Schoenberg actually was living in the United States as well. He studied with Rimsky-Korsakov, who we remember gave us the whole tone scale that Debussy used. And he wrote a variety of works, including a symphony. He wrote a symphony of Psalms, one of his great choral works, three major ballets. These are what he's most known for: the Firebird, Petrushka, which also gets its own chord. It's a C major chord and an F sharp major chord stacked together. So just like Tristan and Isolde, he gets his own chord called the Petrushka chord. And the Rite of Spring, which, fun fact about the Rite of Spring, when he debuted it, it caused such a stir that people started rioting. And yes, that's fun. So, anyways, his music has what I would describe as almost a violent quality. There's a lot of sounds crashing into each other and interrupting each other, but it's much more tonal. His inspirations came from Russian folk tunes and Russian legends. He utilized, remember Rimsky-Korsakov gave us the whole tone scale? Well, he also gave us what's called an octatonic scale, which is a very Russian sound, and Stravinsky used it a lot. It's basically, in a regular scale, you have 7 pitches plus the octave. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So this one changes the half steps and whole steps a little bit so you can squeeze one extra note in there, so you wind up with 8 instead of 7. Anyways, Stravinsky introduces us to the idea of unpredictable accents that throw off the rhythm, which, you know, we kind of heard that in Beethoven some. But he gives us the modern concept of changing time signatures, which is something that we hadn't seen before. So I want you to listen to bits and pieces of the last 3 scenes of his Firebird ballet. And the video I have on YouTube is actually conducted by Stravinsky himself. And it's introduced by Leonard Bernstein, who himself was a famous conductor, music educator, and he wrote West Side Story. So, if you don't listen to all of it, at least scroll through so you can hear different parts, because there's probably a lot of it that you're going to recognize. So take a listen to bits and pieces of the last 3 acts of the Firebird. Okay, and I'm going to mention one more modernist composer. This will be another one that's going to be difficult to listen to. And then I promise you, for the rest of this week, we're going to look at more tonal stuff. A little bit on jazz and rhythm and blue and rock and Broadway and some other stuff that's just bizarre. But we're going to, like aleatoric music and John Cage, but we'll get to that later. Charles Ives. Modernist composer, but with an American flavor. He was trained as an organist and a pianist. His father taught band, was a church musician, and was a school music teacher. So Ives was exposed to a lot of styles of music. And he basically took these modernist ideas, the atonality, the crazy chords, the changing rhythms, and he fused them with traditional songs. He wrote what's called polytonal music, which is music that's playing in multiple keys simultaneously. He also wrote atonal parts combined with tonal parts, and that was his big innovative thing that others had not done before. He borrowed from American popular songs and hymns, which made some people turn their noses up at him, like, that stuff doesn't belong in a concert hall. One of Ives' pieces that exemplifies this mixing of styles is his General William Booth Enters into Heaven. That is the full title of the song. You're going to hear his really thick chords that don't make a lot of sense to our ears. You're going to hear them played in a way that kind of imitates a drum rhythm. You're going to hear him mix different harmonies, and he's kind of mixing 2 different hymns as well, and some American-sourced poetry. So take a listen to a little bit of it, and if you're interested, the San Francisco Symphony also has another keeping score film on Ives. So listen to that with, again, his polytonal music, this idea of multiple keys going simultaneously.